scrappiness and the fear of God.
If you can maintain your optimism about things, do that because that is way more fun.
Your readers aren't stupid, like they're gonna see that.
I cannot believe the source actually said that. Like, they gave us absolutely nothing, and that's exactly what we needed.
Literally, eventually tying Washed Up back into helping student journalists.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Washed Up. We are here for a little special episode, an evergreen episode, as we called it in the biz, also known as an HFR, hold for release. Basically, a timeless episode where we're just going to be telling you some stories about our time in journalism, how we ended up here, on what authority we're speaking when we're delivering you our news, because Abby and I both went to college together and the same journalism program, and we learned a lot of lessons.
True to our name, we are, in fact, living up our glory days, talking about our time in college, as you can say, washed up. Funny story is, I remember meeting up with a different college alumni who is 4 years older than us, and I told her about our podcast, and she was like, "Washed up, aren't you guys like 23?" So I think it's fun and important to do episodes like this, especially because these lessons are still applicable to us and me and this in our everyday lives and the reason why we're doing what we're doing, but also because I think washed up could be something so much bigger that actually ends up helping student journalists because like Colin and I mention all the time, like it's something that we hold very dear to our hearts.
Yeah, I mean, we're only a couple of years out of school, but we are kind of at that point in our own professional lives where now people who we used to know back in school who are now graduating or whatnot are starting to ask us for career advice and realizing that we do have something to give back. So it would be nice to kind of share some of that experience with anyone who's interested. Maybe you're a student right now, maybe you want to be a professional writer at some point. It's very difficult to break into, but there is a pathway out there, and journalism is not dead. It is still very much something that, if you really want to make a career out of, you can. We neither of us are technically journalists, definitely not for any legacy outlets, as our audience knows. We are not the biggest fans of legacy media, but I mean, I'm not going to tell you what I do for my 9 to 5, but I am a professional writer paid to write. So there's options out there, many, many options.
Yes, and our journalistic sides, our reporting sides, like we still do, obviously, if you're a fan of us, you know what we do here. And I think that what you learn in student journalism doesn't just apply to journalism as well. And if you're scared to start, if you want any advice, this is what we are here for. So let's get into some of our tips.
Yeah, look, let's start with a very general one that just kind of cuts across, like you were saying, all different aspects of life. One of the biggest lessons I learned in journalism from one of our advisors at college is that your integrity is all that you have. You build it very slowly and you can lose it very quickly. There's a lot to unpack there, but especially when you're in journalism, you need to build that trust with the people who you're writing for and also build trust with the people that you're working with on different stories. And it's not a very forgiving business because you're there to deliver the truth to people. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room. And I would just say that integrity, building character on a personal level also carries through into your work. And so if you're not living your life in a particularly honest or upright way, then I do think that will hinder your ability to be an effective journalist because you should be looking to and striving for delivering the truth to a wide array of people as effectively as you can.
And all of our washed up listeners know exactly how Colin and I feel about accountability, but I think it first starts with the reporter, the storyteller, the journalist in you to keep that integrity alive within you, being accountable to the facts, something that I think people need to do more often is admit when they're wrong. I think it's really hard to do, but as a team too, holding each other accountable. I really like this piece of advice because it's just so true. Like it takes a bit to earn someone's trust and build this reputation for yourself and your name, but it is so easily taken down. Like one mistake and it could be over. Not saying that making mistakes isn't okay, because I definitely think that when you are making mistakes, it's really important to figure out the lesson there and that as a student, you're allowed to make those mistakes and not feel like you have to be perfect all the time too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of growth that can come out of making mistakes. If be it something as small as like a copy editing error, or as big as a story falls through and doesn't work out how you guys had planned as a group or as a team, or you know, something goes awry. You can always learn from the specific incident and extrapolate something out of it so that you do better next time. And hopefully, you're with a team and a group that is understanding and all supportive of one another, such that that is actually possible. And yeah, what you're saying about perfectionism as well, that was something very hard for me to let go of, but it was actually. I went to a media conference, which there's many of annually. Totally recommend going to those. And I remember I was standing in line to submit our paper for different awards that they offer at these conferences, and I was trying to decide like which copy to submit for an award. And the woman who I was submitting the copy to kind of looked at me like, okay, kid, like make up your mind. And I remember what she said to me was like, it's okay. There's no such thing as a perfect copy anyway. And I was like, oh yeah. And I think I ended up picking one that I don't know if it won anything, but that advice from her stuck with me. There's no such thing as perfect copy.
Yeah, and I think this also goes into allowing yourself and your team to pick each other up and not always compete with one another. I think something I learned in college and I'm still learning to this day is that you don't need to compete with your coworkers, with the people around you, because you should be able to build each other up. Like stories, why would you be jealous of each other or your stories or your pitches or your writing or your broadcasting, whatever you're doing, when you guys should be on the same team and you're writing for the same cause?
I might offer a little bit of a countervailing point to that, which is I think healthy competition is a wonderful thing.
Hmm.
We, at our old college, were in competition with, although on the same team as our student TV run organization.
Those.
So they were doing broadcast and we were doing print media, which are very different, but we would oftentimes cover the same stories, topics, etc. And we may or may not have kept a running tally of how many stories we beat them to the punch to. Which, to be fair, our editorial process began earlier in the week than theirs, so we oftentimes would have the advantage already. But
We had a bigger staff than them too.
yeah, they did a great job.
Yeah.
I just think a little bit of competition can restore and actually produce better results. It drove us to write better stories and be interesting.
I I agree with you actually. But I will say, do not hate on yourself for maybe not pitching the story right away or hate on your coworkers for having better voices than you because I think all voices are like super unique and can be further developed.
Right. That actually raises a really good point that I know you were really big on when we were working together at our student paper. You were very good at making sure that the writer's voice wasn't being suffocated, because that's a big thing for young writers who are still trying to find their voice. You shouldn't expect necessarily right away to have this super distinct and clear and, excellent style, perfect all around. And so when you're taking advice from your editors, or if you're an editor giving advice to another person, it's really important to keep in mind cultivating that person's voice and developing what makes it unique, as opposed to trying to impose your own preferences and voice onto that person, which 10 out of 10 times they're going to resist, and rightfully so, because it's extremely kind of oppressive in a way. Like we all have our own voice. We should be striving to develop it, cultivate it, and working with people who want to help us cultivate that as well.
And it's a really thin line, I want to say, especially when, say, you've been working for the paper longer than someone and somebody's new and doesn't really know maybe how to write journalistically yet or needs more help. It's really important to conserve what they're trying to say in the story and how they're saying it. I always used to tell myself that if it doesn't need to be edited, then don't touch it because there's so many different ways that you can say something happened in a sentence. Like, you should not be touching somebody's story in a way that is just saying it differently just because you think it sounds better. Like, yes, grammar-wise, like, yes, if it doesn't make sense, and yes, like the structure of things, but to change like wow for but, like those are just dumb edits, and I think it's hard to relinquish control sometimes.
Definitely. Not that I don't disagree with that at all, but I will offer again a little bit of a countervailing point to that also. I think two things can be true at the same time,
Hmm.
and totally I 100% agree with that. I also think it can be true that sometimes the exact phrasing of something is super, super important, and
More so in news, I want to say.
definitely. We tried to avoid sort of like the tedium of getting caught up in every single word and having heated debates and arguments sometimes. I think for the most part we were successful in avoiding that because it was just like unnecessary. But every once in a while, like the whole story will hinge on one word, and the way that you phrase it is very important because you want to be as accurate as you possibly can. You want to be very precise. You could always be more precise, and you should be going into writing a story, especially news, with that sort of mentality of like, how can I make this more accurate? And so sometimes having those fights is important because different preferences are going to come up, and I think it's incumbent on everyone to express the best argument for why their preference is the best way to go. And that's how the product gets better.
Oh man, I am remembering fights, not fights, arguments, healthy arguments over certain words so vividly right now, just in different times in the newsroom, just and I remember one of our mutual friends had nothing to do with the writing process ever. She's an art director, and she said to me outside the newsroom, "It's so interesting listening to you guys talk. Like, what's the difference between a semicolon and this?" And she's like, "I would just get so distracted just listening to you guys argue about these things that I would never think to even touch." And I think that was also very fun, copy-wise.
I think we were very efficacious with our time while we were in the newsroom and very like task oriented and diligent. We're having the right conversations, I always felt. But yeah, every once in a while, like we definitely had conversations that probably went on for an hour or two
Too long.
about just like
Too long.
the framing of like one story. And we were
Yeah.
on the hook for 12 pages every single week. And yet we would sometimes get dragged into these conversations that would be wide, wide ranging.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, not everyone is going to be happy with it. That goes for both your readers and sometimes the people on the staff. But at least having the conversation and giving the people opportunity to express and feel like they're being heard as a part of a team is extremely important.
Yeah, and you also have to just choose whether or not something is worth being fought over too.
Yeah,
And
pick
I
your
think,
battles.
yeah, and I definitely think that that has to do with welcoming people into the newsroom, but also not getting the product lost in trying to make people be like, "Oh, your work is perfect." You know what I'm saying? Like just having that healthy balance of that, I think is very much important. Someone's voice versus precise, accurate wording, especially when it comes to news or something more hard-hitting. Speaking of news, let's talk about a killer instinct.
Okay. Okay, we have talked about this on Washed Up before when there was the Signalgate scandal, where basically a journalist from The Atlantic was added in with a bunch of top-ranking cabinet members discussing war plans. And we talked about if we were that journalist in that position, would we go ahead and publish what was going on in that discussion? Do we have that instinct of, this is an amazing opportunity for a story, I must deliver it because this isn't going to happen again?
I think that having a killer instinct is a spectrum. We used to always compare it to like our advisor has a our advisor had a really big killer instinct, at least like in the stories that she would tell us, or sometimes when we were interviewing someone or had a different source, she would be like, go harder on them or tell them this or do that. And I think cultivating that is goes different ways for every person. I don't think that just because you're quieter, maybe you wouldn't expect yourself to be in that scenario doesn't mean that you don't have it. killer is a very strong word, but I honestly think it's more about finding the story in the questions that you're asking people and getting your interviewee to tell you something that maybe they wouldn't otherwise tell you through artful question asking.
Yeah, and I also think it matters a lot what kind of media you're producing,
Right.
what industry you're geared toward as well. Because I think if you're still in the legacy media outlet in print or broadcast, I think those industries are just so competitive that like if the only way to make it in those lanes is to have that killer instinct. Where if a story just falls into your hands, like you should, and actually it's probably it's your duty to bring that forward and to report it. However, if you are, for instance, a podcast, it's a little bit up to your discretion. Like we don't
I mean, I
feel
feel like we're
like
still learning too.
we don't feel like we need to go out guns blazing every single episode. I think we try our best to talk about serious things and to do so in a responsible way. And sometimes that means not talking if we feel like we're not the right ones to be speaking about something. And so you could say, well, they don't have the killer instinct because they're not bringing up this, this, this. But really, it's more of like this lane that we've chosen has a little bit different standards than, say, if we were working at CBS. But if we were working at CBS, then we would have to talk about the most hard-hitting stuff all the time.
That also is a really good point to bring up in terms of different media outlets too, because maybe based on your personality, you want to do different things. I think as I've grown older, I've realized how I can differently frame stories or differently talk about things in terms of my like quote like killer instinct. Some episodes, like I think I come in hotter than others maybe because my personal biases come in, which I'm allowed to do on an independent media commentary podcast that sometimes I'm like, oh, I very much care about this. Even just choosing the stories that you're writing is already an implicit form of biases, anyways. So it really just depends on who you are and how you develop and what kind of journalism, if any journalism, you'd like to be involved in.
Yeah, and I think being a podcast also affords, like you were saying, a little bit more of that subjectivity to come through, versus if you are planning to go into news writing, that's sort of the enemy of news writing. I think news writing requires a certain steadiness, a certain dedication to the facts, no matter where they lead, no matter your own subjective perspective on things,
Right.
to the point where, honestly, the worst thing a news writer can do is to become part of the story. You are obligated to maintain a level of objectivity. And yeah, I think here we have a little bit more leeway because we do have emotion about stuff as all people do. And we're able to express that in relationship to these different stories. And in a way, it kind of feels like we're by commenting on it, not that we're involving ourselves in it, but it is having like personal consequence for us in a way where I don't think newswriters should venture into that necessarily.
Speaking of emotions and subjectivity, I think telling yourself that there's other things out there too when it comes to news writing and not getting sucked into this cynicism is also very important. Colin and I have talked multiple times about skepticism and, media literacy and talking about how because of the people that we are and like what we went through in college and stuff, that we look at things maybe differently than people who haven't taken a class like that or haven't experienced something like that. Or maybe they do. I think people are getting better at being skeptical. But I think there is a line between cynicism and skepticism, and you should still allow yourself to enjoy certain things while you're able to hold up your journalistic integrity in writing these things and calling in all sides and not letting outside factors impact your personal story, your personal life.
Yeah, expanding on that a little bit, I have the hardest time now whenever I'm watching TV. I don't watch TV at all nowadays because it's almost unbearable because of how skeptical I am about the ways that any kind of media is using a form of narrative and storytelling, and they oftentimes have some kind of an agenda. And so consuming media, whether that just be like an advertisement online or like a movie, my brain like cannot shut off from dissecting all of the decisions in the editorial process that must have gone into making it, that it almost makes it like unpleasant and not worth consuming. So I've honestly stopped like consuming most forms of digital media aside from again like trusted news sources who I really respect and have built up some level of trust in, where I can actually receive what they're saying without second guessing every little detail of it. But I would encourage other people, if you can maintain your optimism about things, do that because that is way more fun than being, like you said, a cynic. Learn to be skeptical, but not necessarily cynical about every little thing.
Yeah, it's really important to hold on to your optimism. I think even now, like when we report on certain stories or after recording, Colin and will just like take a fresh breath and be like, "Oh my God, it's over." Because it is really hard to talk about these bad things over and over and over again. And you shouldn't let that ruin your sparkle, like your innocence. Like I think every single person has this level of humanhood and personhood sparkle that I hope no one ever gets rid of, and I hope that I still have late in my years as an adult.
That being said, we used to do a segment on Washed Up where we would open every episode with a bit of optimism and like a positive news story. We would surprise one another by bringing something to the table the other didn't know about. And we kind of killed that segment because neither of us could ever find a positive story. It was just so like
So
brutal.
bad we would be like,
We would spend more time per week trying to find a positive story than like the other rest of the episode of the actual news. And so it kind of just faded out. I'm not opposed to doing that. Like deliberately attuning yourself to seeking out positive stuff is great. Like practice gratitude, practice positivity, optimism in your personal life. But it is hard when you're in media where there's another saying in media, if it bleeds, it leads.
hmm,
And that idea of, the most tragic, the most gut-wrenching stuff has to be the stuff that we focus on and put out there because that's what's going to get the most views and
most
clicks and
clicks.
attention. And that if you're working at a legacy media outlet, the most money you're going to bring in that way. It's only business, and media is a business. And so it makes sense why things are that way, but I also don't think as a society it's necessarily serving us that well to always be attuned to the most negative stuff on a 24-hour loop.
And this is advice that I think I'm still taking in every day and trying to practice every day because like it's hard. It really is. Um, I think another really classic journalism tip that probably so many people have heard is that all press is good press. This one is really important. I actually feel like it applies to you as the journalist as well. Like if you're writing a story and maybe you're not getting the best responses, even on Washed Up, like we'll get tons of hate comments, honestly, which we've addressed before. And we always say that all comments are good things because it's leading us to a wider audience. Maybe it's not the audience that wants to intake our content all the time, but it's definitely boosting us somehow. And
If you learn how to
yeah,
depersonalize, like people are commenting, but very rarely is it actually like I don't think we've ever gotten personal comments about like you guys. Well, actually, no, we have. But
immediate switch.
but like aside, if you can learn to depersonalize it and kind of again use that media literacy to see through behind what someone is saying to uncover what their motivation might be or what their agenda might be underlying the comment, then you can actually learn something, and we use that to improve our own product, even if it's a negative comment of some variety. It's telling us something about what people out there are thinking and giving us a healthy amount of pushback so that we can actually consider those points because I don't think we would be being honest in what we're doing or being as successful as we could be if we weren't considering the ways we could be wrong.
I think that you, Colin, do a really good job at reminding me to look at people. in their backgrounds and being like, oh, like, why would they say this? And maybe they said this because of this, and it's just a projection of what they're actually thinking. Like, you always say that to me, and I'm like,
All accusations are a confession.
yeah, and I have really taken that into honestly everyday life. It's really helped me. In my writing, it helps me. In the podcast, it helps me. So I think it will help a lot of you too.
Well, that's my background in psychology coming through. Anytime someone is acting a fool, I'm like, who hurt you in childhood? Like, and I apply that to our audience members as well. So, um, again, we'll take any hate comments you have for us, but please try to make them constructive whenever you do leave comments.
Do you want to talk a little bit about interviewing, perhaps?
Sure, yeah, that's definitely, it's not something we do a ton on Washed Up, but we definitely have a background in that.
Yeah, yeah, for us in the Vista, we used to always tell our students, or not our students, our peers, people who worked for the Vista, that they should always have like 2 to 3 sources, even if it was a reaction piece. But I think that there's such an art form to asking questions in a journalistic way. I also think that once something is said, it's pretty much fair game. I think that's the difference between an entertainer and a journalist. Like an entertainer, somebody who's just asking so many questions, like an influencer, and gathering their like quote like story may like be able to share the copy with the person or ask them if anything makes them want to take something back. But I think that the sign of a good journalist is somebody who knows that once it's said, it's kind of out there. Not saying that you don't have integrity with that, because that's also something that I think we had a lot of experience in the newsroom. Like I'm thinking of multiple stories where people were like,
We'd all like gather in the newsroom and be like, I cannot believe the source actually said that. Like,
well, we would do that. And then sometimes the source would be like, hey, I want to be anonymous. A funny story I'm thinking of right now is when when one of our writers interviewed our school mascot. For some reason, this was the story that made us like stay 2 hours longer
yeah,
in the
when I was
newsroom.
talking about tedious discussions, this was what I was referring to actually.
Yeah, it was a very interesting discussion. I think it was like all of us on our exec team, and then it was our news editor
It
who
was
was from
all
Wisconsin.
valid, but there was just no right answer.
It was just like I think there's a difference between leaving in a source and deciding to use their word once that comes out because it's just silly. Like it's just about being a school mascot versus deciding not to have a source because maybe they were a victim of something or something more pressing happened and they're uncomfortable with that. Like I think that's when your journalistic integrity comes in and you're like your integrity is fighting with your journalism side of that killer instinct. And I think that's why the killer instinct is a spectrum.
Totally. And adding just a little bit of detail to that story about the school mascot, she went on the record, gave her quote about being the school mascot and her name, and then decided to pull back and said, actually, I don't want it out there. And the here's another lesson for you. If you don't like something, don't draw attention to it because all of us then talked about this for 2 hours, and
Hours.
I still remember the girl's name. So if you don't want to be known as the school mascot, then don't draw attention to not wanting to be known as a school mascot. It could have been a really fun, lighthearted, kind of like soft story, but then it turned into this very serious debate, which was actually kind of funny in retrospect.
Like now that we look back on it, it's like, why were we arguing about if we should leave this girl's name in it or not? I think we were like 50-50 split, and then it was 75-25, and then we were like, well, majority wins, we're out of
She
here.
wasn't like a whistleblower.
She, anyways,
We had whistleblowers, and she was not one of them. But to your point about sources and all of this, this is another big part of it. Our advisor used to always tell us work your sources. So, have a goal in mind when you're deciding who to communicate with, know what kind of information you're seeking, build that relationship with a bunch of different people so that when a story happens, you know who to turn to, you
hmm
have the rapport, you have the trust, and then you can just, get a good quote. That's so important. It's such a huge part of journalism. Protecting your sources so that they feel like they're
protecting your
valued
sources.
in that. We usually didn't like to grant anonymity because it just complicated stories, but in the real world of journalism, there's a lot of anonymous sourcing that goes on because you don't want to burn those bridges. and you're allowed to do that.
Corroborating those sources too. I think in college, something that I practiced was my sources. I had a lot of consistent like sources who would tell me things, but if they didn't want it out there, then and they're not on the record telling me something, I'm not going to turn around and stab them and be like, well, you told me. I think getting permission to write about someone is the difference between like a skeevy journalist and like not so skeevy, like in terms of an interview.
You have to be very discerning about stuff like that. And
Accountability.
another thing about sources I just remembered when you were speaking, there's another saying in journalism of if your mother tells you that she loves you, get a second source. And that's true. I would actually say get a third source too, because having more people on the record all saying the same thing just makes publishing a story feel so much easier and simpler, and you feel more confident about what you have to say. I think single source on a story, especially news, is not acceptable. You at least need two, I would even say three, representing if there's two split perspectives on it, certainly one that speaks to each perspective and maybe a neutral or arbitrary arbitrator, something like that. But yeah, more sources the better.
I think the hard part about being a journalist too is obviously you're, especially in news, is you're keeping up with the news, you have your own opinions. Seeking out that opposite side and that opposite opinion is integral. Like it makes the story a full story. When you're writing news, you want it to be out there and for the reader to decide, hey, this is information, now I'm going to make my own opinion about it. And I think it's actually something that I've gotten better at through Washed Up, honestly. I think it was really hard for me to want to talk to people I disagreed with. Like I did it anyway, but now I give way more doubt and lenience into leaning into sources or I mean not that we have too many sources. Leaning into news sources and information gathering from all sides of different political spectrum because I want to understand it from every single head space before I like make my own opinion and then tell everyone on Washed Up.
Yeah, totally. There's a psychology concept that kind of describes what you're saying of cognitive dissonance, where we don't like information that conflicts with our pre-existing beliefs because it's very effortful to change your beliefs and opinions about things. So we'd rather just hold on to what we already believe. And then there's also confirmation bias, which is seeking out what you already
Mhm.
believe as again a way of bolstering so that you don't have to change your opinion. But I think we've definitely come to recognize through this show and through our student journalism experience, like you said, it's such a pillar of truth seeking to get as many perspectives as you can and then try to kind of find the through line between all of it, or at least providing enough information that your audience can make those extrapolations and conclusions. So yeah, we try to do that here on Washed Up. Definitely try to do that as student journalists. And if you're writing just hard news, then you absolutely must do that and seek that out. I wanted to talk a little bit about PR and the role of interacting with public relations people when you're in the media, and maybe some of our past experiences about that.
I think when we interacted with PR, it got harder the older that we got. I think that their rules became more stringent. I'm really not sure how it works now there or if they even are able to speak to PR anymore. But I do think that a journalist relationship with a public relations person is a very delicate dance. You don't want to upset somebody who is doing PR, and you also want to understand them in their job as a person, like what they're doing, and read in between the lines when they're giving you quotes too. Sometimes the best quotes are the ones where you're writing and you're getting other sources and then proving facts and this PR person for whatever org or your school or anything like that says something and it's just so blatantly PR. Like your readers aren't stupid. Like they're gonna see that and be like, this does not make any sense. Why do they say that? There are multiple times I think that that happened with us, I want to say, in multiple stories that I was like, this is perfect that they said that because now I have it
They
completely together.
they gave us absolutely nothing, and that's exactly what we needed.
Literally, we would always say that to our new writers too. We'd be like, don't be afraid. Like, and if they don't give us nothing, or if they don't give us anything, we could literally say that
Hmm.
the university doesn't want to comment on this, blah, 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 whatever. But I think the older I get, the more I understand that everyone's just doing their job. I think when I was younger, it made me a little angrier when PR maybe got in the way of things. But that also doesn't lessen what you are as a student journalist.
Working with PR had definitely taught me how strategy minded a lot of professionals are. I mean, it
Hmm.
only makes sense. But yeah, it's such a delicate balance and dance between journalism and PR. I'm thinking of an example of, so we would reach out to them with our questions about the upcoming stories that we would have because we were getting quotes to then put into those stories before they got published. That's the whole process. So we would often reach out early in the week saying, we have to write our emails in such a way of explaining what the story is around, but not giving away necessarily all the information that we had that we were then going to publish, but just hitting on what was relevant for them to be commenting about. Very tricky art to kind of master
Very
that.
tricky.
But I realized after a certain point that in as much as we were looking to them for answers about certain issues, they were looking to what we were asking them to inform certain strategy, even around how the university was operating. And so I remember we had messaged them about an upcoming planned protest that was happening on one end of the campus. And then we also were asking them about a separate thing about a building construction that was being delayed. And that very end of that week, they planned an event on the opposite side of campus to give updates about how this construction process was going along well and it was all on track. And I remember realizing, like, oh crap, they realized we were asking them about these two stories that might not reflect that well on them, and they were using that to inform their strategy to bolster the PR of the university. And that's their job. Like they're within their right to do that. But it was very eye-opening about how strategic people are in the PR world. Like if you're ever dealing with publicists and their job is to protect someone's reputation,
Hmm.
those people are very good at what they do and they will use any information they can get, any mechanism they have to defend that person.
People often say that PR is the shadow side of journalism, and I totally agree with that. Even in like the classes you take, you learn so much about it, and understanding a PR person's role would really help you as a writer and as an interviewer, as a news gatherer, and don't take them don't take them for granted either.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely had to do exercises where we were like writing PR on behalf of like a fictional person who we were trying to, explain like different situations and whatnot. And that was a good exercise, like you said, to get in the headspace so that you can ask better questions as a journalist. That's really what it's all about, is how can you as a journalist learn to ask the questions that are going to get the information that you need. And it's such a tricky skill, but um, you know, watch other people and journalists who do broadcast interviews and they just will post the entire thing. You can learn a lot from the ways that you kind of set up the interviewee to give you the information. Um, Sometimes it's a little bit strategic also, and you need to learn how to be strategic in the same way that PR is strategic to evoke that information.
Agreed. I think that the last tip that Washed Up should land on is our very own um little euphemisms, um, scrappiness and the fear of God. I think that we have talked about this a few times, but I don't think we've ever truly laid into it and what it means to us. And honestly, it's literally like in our like
It's a
mission statement.
lifestyle.
And it's still true to this day of who I am as a person, and honestly, so much that we did. But basically, the fear of God is this joke that I don't even know how it started, but Colin and I and a few other like friends at the paper at the time would always talk about how in everything that we do, we need to have this like quote fear of God.
It started with being raised very Catholic,
Yeah, I think a bunch
and
of
it
us are
carried
like
through.
talking about that. But basically, it doesn't have anything to do with Catholicism. Maybe a little bit. Maybe a little bit of actual fear of God. But I would attune it to kind of beating yourself to a story, like making sure you're always hungry for something. I think that's the reason why Washed Up is what it is today, because even Colin and I will talk about like now that we have our 70 subscribers, we're like letting them down when we're not publishing it right away. Or like the other day, like I edited one of our episodes in like a time crunch because I was like, I need to get this out. Like that quote, like fear of God is so important in being a timely storyteller and in getting the facts right and in being afraid of messing something up.
I think I can speak to the scrappiness piece a little bit, and that is sort of doing a lot with a little. So you might not always have the most resources available at your disposal. This was especially true when we were students. Like none of us had money, resources, whatever, but we would find a way to, where there's a will, there's a way, basically. So like I remember one of our mutual friends of Abby and me. We were working on a story together, and it was nearing the end of the week. We still hadn't heard back from a source, so we like found friends of his and tracked down to like what dorm he lived in, and we walked through the building trying to find it, like, and we eventually found this person's room and like slid a note under their door, and it was this whole thing. Very scrappy
So
because in the
scrappy.
real world you might not be tracking down sources quite like that, but we were adamant of like we need this person to comment on this story. We're gonna do everything that we can to make it happen. Where there's a will, there's a way. You know, like breaking down doors if we have to. We didn't, but we might have if we hadn't found another way inside. And so, yeah, that's the scrappiness component. And then the fear of God, I think, again, it's kind of a joke, but
But it's
um,
not.
I think having a bit of eagerness about you gets you a long way. I
Yeah.
remember, so when I was having to hire people to work at the Vista, that was one thing that really stood out in interviews was people who showed up with this enthusiasm and this eagerness of like, I want to prove myself here because this is so important to me, and I see the potential that, working for this organization, where that could lead me. Those writers were always fantastic to work with because they would always be on top of things. You wouldn't have to be second guessing every editorial decision that they were making. They would oftentimes not be pushing back too hard on us. So it just made the whole process a lot smoother. And yeah, just having a bit of eagerness and enthusiasm because if you don't actually want it, then why would you go after it? It just doesn't make any sense. But we try to carry that forward in Washed Up
Honestly,
now.
in everything we do, I think Washed Up is the epitome of scrap. Like in our adulthood, Colin and I working full-time jobs, still doing this, managing a social life. I feel like I talk about it all the time, and sometimes even beating legacy media to stuff just because we have more scrappiness and the fear of God in us than they do.
Yeah, and that's the other thing is if you're really, really scrappy, you can find a way to tell the story that no one else is telling because you're seeing things that, like again, the legacy media might not be seeing at all. And that's been the most gratifying part of all of it is when we do get to present a narrative to people that is completely original because it's informed solely based off of our own experience at this point and our, I don't know, combined 6 or so years of working in reporting and journalism. And I'm so excited because I feel like it's only going to go up from here in our ability to deliver those types of stories.
Yeah, and I'm also excited. Colin and I always talk about the growth of Washed Up and eventually tying Washed Up back into helping student journalists. I think that the most important thing to remember as a student journalist is that your job is real. I think it's really easy to feel like you don't matter because you're a student, but that fear of God and that scrappiness it like lives within you and you need to hold on to that in your future endeavors as well and not forget kind of where you came from. Speaking of reliving our glory days and being hella washed up.
On that note,
Washed
washed
up
up
out.
out.